this assessment for? What are the purpose of it? Which of these purposes are most important, and how do we need to think about them to move on? I'll manage each of them as we move through the session. But we're going to start off with Louise Hayward. I'm really delighted about that. I've admired Louise Hayward's work for a very long time. Louise has been active right across education in Scotland for a long time, although you'll not realise that when you see her. She's obviously got the Dorian Gray vibe going, something that I've yet to master. You'll see that I've moved from lockdown mode to looking as if I've been taken hostage mode. But Louise had that involvement. And what she's always had for me is an ability to bring both common sense and academic rigor and good humour to the discussion around assessment. So I'm going to ask Louise to say a whole set of topics for tonight. Louise.
David, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, where I think that the main message was that this is the end of my career, where you feel very liberated in what you say, because you're right that a number of us in this meeting have been through a whole series of cycles of innovation, and it would be good to think that we could learn and grow from the experiences that we've had. I'm so delighted that there are so many people at this
too much going on
session who are interested in assessment. Because in my humble opinion, there aren't enough people who are really interested in assessment. And if there isn't sufficient interest in assessment, then as David says, it can become a vulture that sits on the bones of Scottish education. Okay, could we start the slideshow, please? Okay, thank you. So the challenge really is to think about creating a creative assessment culture. And that, I think, is a really exciting opportunity. And there are 4 sections to what I'd like to talk about. The first one is to think about curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment, and how these interrelate. And then to make a heartfelt plea in relation to assessment, to then think about how assessment might be transformed to become a creative force. And then I'd like to share some work that's been going on internationally with you about how people from 12 different nations and states are thinking about the future of assessment, the kinds of disruptors that we've all been living through, and then what assessment imperatives might we develop for citizens to thrive in uncertain and disruptive times. So if you were seeing the slideshow just now, what you would be seeing is a piece of DNA. And what I would like to argue is that curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment are like the threads in a piece of rope, that they come together, and what they constitute are the DNA of learning. And that we shouldn't ever think about curriculum without thinking about pedagogy and without thinking about assessment. Because if curriculum is what, as a society, we argue matters for young people to become educated citizens, and pedagogy represents the ways in which we bring together young people with ideas in the curriculum to help them grow and develop. And then assessment is how much and how well are young people learning in relation to everything that matters. And learning is at the core of all of this. The last couple of years, I've been working with OECD on a project called Learning Compass 2030. And they're arguing that we need to rethink the curriculum, to think about it as the relationship between what we as a society argue is really important, and then how individuals and groups of young people navigate their way through these processes. And it's as much about the well-being of society as it is of the individual. And it's a much more flexible, creative way of looking at the curriculum and what matters. But for any of you who are involved in, and they talk about the learning compass, but for any of you who are involved, who've ever been involved in sailing, you know that a compass can be put off course by variation and deviation. And that's often what assessment does. That unless, when we're thinking about what matters in the curriculum, we also think about what matters for young people to learn and the progress that they're likely to make in that learning, then assessment will always throw the curriculum off course. So the well-being of a society is a shared destination, and it's about an understanding of what it will take to travel towards that. So if I come to the question, what might a creative assessment culture look like? I would argue that there is one change that matters more than any other. You often see assessment described as being used for a variety of purposes, be these formative purposes to inform learning, or summative to sum up learning, or diagnostic to take a closer look at someone's learning, for purposes of selection, to further higher education or into employment, or for purposes of accountability. But I would argue that there's a very simple way to look at assessment that is actually its essence, because essentially assessment serves two functions. It serves the function of supporting learning or judgment and categorization. And when we try to merge these purposes, it's always the judgment function that is going to win. So the fundamental shift is that we have to reconceptualize assessment as being the process by which we encourage and enable young people to progress towards what as a society we have agreed matters. So if I were then starting to think about principles for 21st century assessment, so as we move to the future, what might a creative assessment culture look like? Well, fundamentally, it would mean that curriculum, assessment, and pedagogy would collectively be focused on learning and on progression in learning. And in terms of assessment, that would relate to progression in what matters in the curriculum, and the evidence would be used to inform the future rather than to summarize the past. It would be an assessment to support the development of new kinds of learners, young people who are creative, self-regulating, collaborative, aspirational, but for the well-being of themselves as individuals, but also as a collective for the kind of society of which we would all want to be part. Assessment itself would promote the active engagement of learners in all aspects of their learning to deepen their understanding of the learning journey itself and of their own progress. And there are huge implications from the UNCRC, from the Convention for Children's Rights, now having brought into legislation for the way that we think about assessment. Assessment would enable and motivate students to show what they can do, they know, they understand, and they can do. And that assessment evidence, be that from classrooms right the way through to nations, it would inform future planning to meet the learning needs of all learners. Within that context, qualifications would be developed to support what matters for students' future growth and development. So what matters in a given society? Tests, in other words, that are worth teaching too. The assessment systems themselves would be designed collaboratively. They would be flexible and they would be under review, and that the evidence emerging from that constant review and evaluation would be as likely to lead to changes in policy as to changes in practice. These are issues that are considered internationally. And as part of a group of 12 countries, researchers and policymakers from 12 countries, from Norway to New Zealand, a number of us have been working to identify what are the shared challenges that countries internationally are facing, and how might we learn with one another in order to try to support these ideas within our nations and across nations. And there's a paper that is just about to be published from this group. It's called the International Educational Assessment Network. And there's a paper which is called Imperatives for a Better Assessment Future Post-COVID. And it's been put together by a subgroup of IEN, Krista Luca, Graham Donaldson, myself, Kelvin Tan from Singapore, and Claire White-Smith from Australia. And what we're arguing is that just now in assessment, COVID has created a disruption. And there are 4 major disruptors that exist internationally. The first of those is that traditional classroom spaces and school walls have in many ways collapsed, and that teachers and learners have been moving swiftly to work in technological environments and using e-spaces, and then they're moving back to classrooms. So there's a disruption in the physical spaces. However, what that has shown is that not everyone has access to learning devices, and that disruption has exposed educational disadvantage that had previously been hidden. The second disruptor is that there are radical changes in practices and in instructional practices, and that we're having to rethink what the core curriculum is and what our assessment priorities might be. COVID has resulted in lessened access to teachers, and that suggests an even more urgent need to cultivate learners and future citizens who have the capacity to address uncertainty, global change, and to care for themselves and for their communities. The third major disruptor has been that there has been widespread international cancellation of large-scale examinations. There's been an increased focus and reliance on teacher professional judgment, and an increased focus and reliance on classroom-based assessment to support and monitor and promote student learning. And the fourth big disruptor is that the pandemic has highlighted equity challenges that are embedded in all of our systems. And it's highlighting the imperative, the need to care for students and to focus on ideas of community, on resilience, on health and well-being, and what equitable access actually looks like. So then, if as societies we're starting to think post-COVID at how we might create a better assessment future, then we're arguing that there are 5 imperatives, and I leave you with those. The first imperative is that assessment should drive learning, assess and therefore drive learning that students will need to succeed in the future, and align what is important for young people to learn and be able to do with what is assessed or examined. Rather than assess what's easy to measure, let's focus on what matters, that young people progress, where young people progress. Imperative 2 is to keep accountability systems designed to evaluate the efficacy of policy and practice on the system level and improvement, rather than on judgment, comparison, and categorization. So focusing assessment for learning, not only on young people in classrooms, but on schools and on nations. Using the evidence to inform and improve, rather than to judge. Imperative 3 is identify, monitor, and respond to the impact of assessment on well-being and plan for positive impact. We know the impact of high-stakes assessment on many of our young people, but if you talk to people in Singapore, then you see how amplified that kind of situation is in that context, and often the highly detrimental effect that it can have on young people. Imperative 4 is use technology to support learning, not as a substitute for teacher decision-making and dialogue with learners. Technology brings the potential for many advantages, but it also brings with it significant risks. And we have to be aware of these risks and to make sure that we're well positioned to be ready to stand against them. And the 5th imperative is to execute a comprehensive and inclusive approach or plan to improve understanding of 21st century assessment across communities. It's as important that we take young people and parents with us as we take policymakers and politicians. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that was really rich, and I know that there were difficulties for people in terms of reception, and we went up and down in terms of the quality of the recording. But I think the messages from that contribution were really clear, and Louise did exactly what I expected her to do, to take us right back to the fundamental questions around assessment. And actually at one point did talk in terms of assessment for learning, which was the drive some years back. But I think what you've also done, Louise, is to broaden that out so we've got a real sense of what's going on internationally. It's very easy for us to get sucked into the issues around baseline assessment in primary or the really specific issues around SQE here. So I think it's really important we get our heads up and see that big picture. And I love that idea of the imperatives. I think that's taken the discussion to a really appropriate and broad level. So thanks for that. What I'm going to do now is bring in Mark Priestley. And Mark Priestley will also bring a lot to this discussion because of his background. Mark's been involved not only in the review, the rapid review that was done of last year's certification difficulties. I usually use the term debacle, but I'm in moderate mood tonight. So Mark did the rapid review of that. He is also seriously involved in the development of curriculum thinking and working with curriculum networks and also around curriculum agency. So like Louise, Mark brings the expertise, he brings the knowledge, but he also brings the breadth of perspective, and in particular will bring the background that he's had in looking at the review this year, although he's not going to major in that in his contribution. So Mark, over to you.
Right, thanks, David. I'll wait for my slides to go up and then I'll make a start. So, well, I'd like to thank Louise, first of all, for, as usual, giving us a really good sort of theoretical and also conceptual basis for thinking about assessment and obviously curriculum as well. It's never a good task actually following Louise because she puts me to shame, I think, in some ways. And I will say that I'm not a specialist on assessment. My area of interest is most definitely curriculum here. But like Louise, I see curriculum assessment pedagogy has been intertwined. Perhaps a slightly different view here. What I'm proposing here is a social practice view of curriculum. As not something that is delivered from a height or dropped onto us or given to us to put into place as some sort of product, but as a set of practices that involves people working together to make in various settings. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But that then requires us to think about what those practices are. And of course, one major practice in curriculum thinking is how we build assessment in. It's how we assess. As well as the pedagogy, how we organize content, knowledge, etc. So I want to start from that point. I'm also going to say a little bit about the qualifications review. I'm going to start off with that, but I'm not going to say very much on that. And what I would like to do is to give you some reflections, first of all, on where I think we are with assessment across the system at the moment in Scotland, and then to think about how we start to configure the system differently so we can do something different, because I'm very aware that as the conversation we had earlier in the group before everyone came in, that assessment changes are often associated with workload, and that's something we certainly don't want to see. In fact, I would make the case that a lot of what we do nowadays is actually very much heavy on workload as well. First slide, please. Okay, so really what I'd like to do is to start off by saying that we do stand at a very interesting point, which is a point of opportunity. We have the OECD review. For those of you who haven't heard much about this, the OECD is due to report towards the middle of this year. There's going to be some stakeholder engagement very shortly. And it's also accompanied by a review of international assessment systems by Gordon Stobart from UCL in London. And I have a great deal of confidence in the OECD review, in fact. I know there's been some criticism, for example, in Parliament last week about the supposed packing of the practitioner forum. But I'm on the practitioner forum, and I certainly don't see that. What I do see is a range of substantial critique of where we are at the moment, some very substantial discussions about that. And I also see an OECD team that brings considerable curriculum expertise, Professor Anne Looney from Ireland and Professor Jan van den Akker from the Netherlands. And I think combined, what we're going to get is a very interesting report that does open up opportunities. I think we also need to mention here the rapid review, which my team and I conducted last year. We had this dropped on us at very short notice. It was, as people probably realise, accompanied by a range of quite vitriolic newspaper coverage about my supposed political orientations. We didn't take that very seriously. But what we did do was have the opportunity to speak to a lot of teachers, head teachers, local authority people, and students and parents as well. And what we saw in that was really interesting. For a start, the pandemic has created a situation where there is pressure to think beyond the traditionally narrow range of assessment methodologies in the senior phase. And I'll come back to that shortly. Secondly, we did see considerable interest in, and indeed enthusiasm for, changing the balance across the system, and a balance between, for example, examinations and continuous assessments. And that didn't just come from teachers and head teachers, it came from within the local authorities, it came from parents, and significantly it came from students as well. And a third thing worthy of note here is that we did find an awful lot of evidence of expertise within the system, and particularly within the FE system. We talked to some FE lecturers as part of the review. And I'd like to add to that there is a lot of expertise in doing moderating continuous assessment in the higher education sector as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to start off here by talking a little bit about the national qualifications, but I don't want to say too much on this. I think it's sufficient to say that the cancellation of the exam diet last year and this year has exposed weaknesses in our existing model. I would call into question here the competency-based model that has been the orthodoxy for around 25 years now. In particular, I'd like to call into question the notion of this ladder of qualifications, where you progress from level 5 to level 6 to level 7, and the associated two-term dash with that. And I don't think that's sustainable, to be honest, in terms of workload. And in the longer term, I think we need to be looking at qualifications which are much more holistic across the entire senior phase, rather than this ladder. Secondly, I'd like to point to the existence of limited assessment methodologies, and what I'm calling here a one-trick pony. Now, that's been seen very, very clearly in a couple of features of the system this year. One of them, as pointed out by Lindsay Patterson quite bluntly, was that we seem to be replacing exams with exams, and a tendency, I think, to see formal testing in terms of a pencil and paper test rather than seeing it in terms of a much more eclectic methodology. So certainly much more discussion to be had about that. And I think certainly we saw with the SQA changes to arrangements that's made the situation worse in some ways, which we pointed out in our report, by, for example, removing coursework from some courses. And of course, what we do see with the current senior phase very clearly, and this is something that comes through so strongly every time I talk to secondary teachers, we've been talking to a lot of head teachers and also experienced teachers on master's courses recently, is the backwash or washback effect that we get from the senior phase onto the BGE. And in particular, two things here. One is a curriculum narrowing. Now, I'm not necessarily complaining here about the curriculum narrowing at S4, which has had a lot of publicity, but what I'm suggesting is that we do narrow the curriculum down to what is coming later on, and that can mean significant narrowing. For example, schools putting students through option choices at the end of S1 in some cases. But we also see in the BGE a great deal of fragmentation, because we tend to see the BGE curriculum as something that has to mirror the senior phase. And so we have a range of subjects rather than thinking of different, more creative ways of organising knowledge in this area. So one question we might want to ask here is, how might we reconfigure qualifications to better align with the core principles of CFE? Next slide, please. Of course, examinations seem to be seen as some sort of gold standard, and I'm not going to say much about this, but perhaps something for the discussion later. But what are exams good for? What are they less good for? Do we ever ask that question? We make an assumption that exams are more accurate, but are they? Why should one set of assessments marked and moderated by teachers be more accurate than another? The idea that exams are more valued in the outside world, well, maybe that's the case, but as professionals, we need to challenge that. And as we said, our National Qualifications Review showed support for alternatives. And then there's this notion, which has been said a lot, particularly in England recently, that exams are fairer for low SES pupils. This is the social justice argument, but the point needs making here that the attainment gap actually narrowed with teacher assessment last year. So perhaps the issue is actually that exams are not fair for low SES pupils. What we do need to think about, I reckon, is fitness for purpose. What are we assessing, and what methods, what methodologies are best for that? And of course, what we do need is significant cultural change here. So a question I can pose here is, how might a more eclectic approach to qualifications better reflect students' achievement in the senior phase? Next slide, please. I had a conversation last week, and I didn't know that the SNSAs were actually referred to as this. Apparently, they're known as snazzers. I just want to say a couple of things about this. The first thing is that, and to echo what Louise says earlier on, that fundamentally a test or an assessment is a judgment. It's what we do with it that's the problem. And of course, the way in which we use the snazzers is I think, very conducive to backwash. We had some evidence for the work we did for the Green Party last summer, for example, of teachers being given the SNSAs a week or so in advance of the test, and having a very concentrated week of focusing on the content. So teaching to the test, we're seeing evidence, I think, and this is coming through HMI, I believe, of narrowing and over focus on the literacy, numeracy, STEM aspects in primaries. And of course, I've been complaining for years about audit approaches to curriculum making associated with the E's and O's. And I think it's important to note here that the old social science adage, garbage in, garbage out, the E's and O's were never designed for assessment. In fact, the original overarching cover paper in 2007 said explicitly they are not designed as assessment criteria. And yet we have continued to use them as such over the years. So another question linked to this is, how can we assess progress without distorting the aims of CFE, without introducing this backwash or washback? Next slide, please. So an alternative approach, I think, across the system, not just for the senior phase, might be to think about a more mixed economy of assessment methods. Exams and tests certainly have their place, I think, but in a limited way. And certainly, yes, to much more continuous school-based assessment. And that means that we need a much broader conception of what constitutes assessment. What sort of methods can we use? How can they be applied? We need also to bear in mind that assessment needs to be proportionate. It needs to be rigorous, yes, but it doesn't need to overload teachers and students. And I'm starting to argue here, and I'm going to say a little bit more about this in the next couple of slides, for an approach which works not in a single school or in a single classroom, but working collaboratively across schools, across clusters, perhaps within the RICS, and what might be called a national system, but locally applied. Next slide, please. So a little word about moderation here, but again, not very much. I'm very happy to talk more about this if necessary. We do have at the moment, I think, moderation overkill. Talking to secondary teachers, for example, about the amount of moderation that goes on around assessment against the E's and O's in S1. This is a second order activity. It's not high stakes, and yet we put an awful lot of time into this, and this becomes burdensome, it becomes bureaucratic, and it's premised very clearly, I think, on the notion that we need to have a sledgehammer to crack a nut. We need to provide evidence for all assessment decisions, because basically we don't trust the system to get it right. Whereas a good moderation system is much more about sampling, it's about quality assurance, but it's a light touch approach. And I can, as I said, I can say more about this, but the question I want to pose here is how can we design moderation systems which are both proportionate and effective? Next slide, please. There are, of course, capacity issues here, and there is a need, for example, to build assessment literacy across the profession. But let's also acknowledge the time pressures. As a teacher in the 90s working in New Zealand, I had 1/5 of my timetable, a full day a week, 5 periods in a 25-period week as non-contact time, and that must be a luxury to many teachers today. Also, the resources. We sort of expect under CFE that schools will produce their own resources, but actually the system could do that. And one of the things that we should be doing, I think, is building much more comprehensive support networks, not as something that's done to teachers from the outside, but something that involves teachers as capacities here. And the question I would ask here is, how do we build this expertise and the system capacity to be able to assess more meaningfully? Next slide, please. Teacher agency has been mentioned. David mentioned it earlier, and I think it's important to note here that teacher agency is much more than often what is characterized as quite a narrow empowerment agenda. This is not about just giving people autonomy, the responsibility, although clearly it's partly about that. It's also about raising capacity. It's about raising the capacity for teachers to make professional judgments with confidence, but also about improving the system so that those confident teachers are also not disabled by that system. So good CLPL, good resources, the availability of good professional networks, etc. And I want to finish off by saying a little bit more about this. So this is about building the conditions where a new assessment system can work and building the agency of teachers within that system. And it does require, I think, a better understanding of that system and how it all works together than we perhaps currently have. Next slide, please. So this table is from our new book, Curriculum Making in Europe, and it shows how curriculum making happens across education systems in different sites of activity. So supra curriculum making is about the sorts of activities the OECD gets up to through, for example, the work Louise is involved in, the generation of ideas. Macro curriculum making is about the development of policy frameworks. Meso is about the mid-level system level stuff, and I'll come back to that because this is important. And then the micro and nano level is what happens in schools. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think it's important here to pick up the absolute significance of meso level activity. We had 9 case studies in our book, and those 9 case studies highlighted that the meso activity, it seems to be the most crucial factor behind successful curriculum making. Where it's absent, we see much more dysfunctional systems. Where it's incomplete, we see systems that don't mesh together as well. So some of the examples of very successful meso level activity include the shared sense making in Finland, where new reform is invariably accompanied by shared sense making activity amongst teachers and local administrators. The availability of expertise through, for example, the Swedish expert teacher or the Cypriot subject counsellors, or the sorts of infrastructure that's available through the junior cycle teams in Ireland, whose role is to support schools to innovate and to bring in change. And it's possible, I think, although early days, that the RICS in Scotland could serve such a function, although at the moment, I think there is a lack of clarity about their role on their subsequent. On the one hand, they're providing support, and on the other hand, they're still involved too much, I think, in the sort of performance data generation type stuff that the local authorities do. So what a meso site of activity is the curriculum making that sits between, or betwixt, to use Valerie Drew, my colleague's term here, betwixt government and school. It's curriculum making that connects practitioners with policy, and it seems, as I said, to be the most crucial factor. Next slide, please. So what we're looking at here is the development of new systems that focus on collegiality instead of hierarchy, that emphasize the importance of teacher networking, the development of support, guidance and resources, and distributed leadership across the networks. And the question I would ask here is that what is the best infrastructure to facilitate this in Scotland? Is it the RICS? Is it the local authorities? Some local authorities, particularly the larger ones, have capacity to do this. Others, the smaller ones, may struggle a little bit. And the important point to note here is that the availability of these networks actually starts to develop system capacity from the bottom up. It can develop system capacity to do things like organising moderation for national qualifications, for organising curriculum making in schools and developing courses, resources and approaches. It could be used, for example, for peer evaluation. And I'm going to be heretical here and suggest that this is a system which in the long term could even replace external inspections. So this is about how we build capacity in the system, by the system, to operate the things that make the system run well. And that can only be done, I think, within the system. And I think for too long we've had a system based on hierarchy and top-down approaches, external judgments and evaluation. And the evidence suggests very strongly that these external accountability measures are often the problem, that they often distort and deform what it is we're trying to do and actively undermine the aspirations in the curriculum. Next slide, please. So the big question here to finish off is, for me, how we as a system foster changes to assessment and curriculum, of course, that will bring it into line with the core purposes, principles and values of the curriculum here. And I'll finish on that now.
I mean, I think this is really powerful in the way that we're building up a clear picture that we won't get change in the system in isolation. And what I think Mark did brilliantly there was working through all of the evidence and all of the research that he talked about around assessment, but running through that, the need for genuine cultural change and a commitment to support that cultural change in the system. And one of the things that's really interesting is that in the Bullock report back in 1974, which nobody else in the room will be able to remember, Bullock actually said that if he felt that we could rely on teacher assessment, he would see no further need for external examinations. And yet we have continued to invest in external examinations and not invest in that capacity for teacher judgment. So lots of issues coming through in that. And I think what both Louise and Mark have done is opened up the whole horizons around this discussion. And while that's important, what I now want to do is bring the focus back down again and bring us to Jen Knussen to talk about how all of this lands and operates within a school and within a classroom. I'm particularly delighted that Jen's doing this, because what Jen's known for and well known for is her commitment to the well-being and care around pupils. The work that she's done in Pachuca East Primary School around changing language so that we think differently about youngsters is well known and is powerful. And to get someone coming from that background to talk about assessment seems to me to be exactly the right kind of approach for us to take. So Jen, how does this all land in the school, the classroom, the teacher and the school leader?
Thanks, David. Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to start off by saying quite unapologetically that our school motto and the value that I live by every day I'm in or out of school is it's all about the bairns. And that's the position I unashamedly take this from. Now, I would like to pick up on what Louise said. She mentioned creativity around assessment, and I absolutely believe in that. Creativity is a big thing for me. Years ago, shortly before I became a head teacher, I was actually a creativity development officer funded by Youth Music Initiative. And at my interview, I can remember saying, talking about classroom practice, you either have creativity or you have fear of getting something wrong. And I think assessment across the spectrum of education is running that risk. If we don't have creativity, we are left with a fear of getting something wrong. We talk about learning and teaching in the 21st century. We're 21 years into that now. Actually, we might still be talking about that in 30 years' time as if it's something that is yet to come. Years ago, and many years ago, I was one of the focus groups that fed into building the curriculum for. And we agreed at that point that the E's and O's are not assessment statements. So what did we do? We asked for assessment statements because we were still dusting down the 5 to 14, where everything was in little boxes and very much assessed. There was very little transference of skills. And in many ways, we were expected to assess things, and nobody had actually said to us, you guys have the autonomy on this. Because we get if we don't have the creativity and we have the fear of getting things wrong, that brings me into the two types of assessment that we're dealing with in primary. And that's the feedback, which is the creativity, which is the moving things forward, very diverse ways of doing that, versus the accountability. And the accountability is a big inhibitor because it throws us right back into that half fear of getting things wrong. Why are we accountable? I'm happy to be accountable to my learners and their families, but there's another accountability that hovers like a dementor at the back of head teachers, and that's the accountability to national statistics. The stretch targets that we had were quite manageable for my catchment area until 2019. They weren't in 2019 because of assessment issues. They're not possibly going to be achievable at the end of this session because we've not been able to do what we did. But that accountability is stifling creativity, and we need to take that bull by the horns. I fell out with a gentleman in my first year of teaching. I was one of those teachers that went to school, to college, back to school again. So I undertook one of these Understanding British Industry courses. I'm still not sure I do understand British industry, but he argued with me that education was fundamentally failing because we knew where children could be and we couldn't get them there. Now, he was talking about exams, getting them through. At that time, it was Highers and 6th year studies. And I argued the point that teaching is not a manufacturing industry. Children do not come in as the same raw product. We cannot apply a process to all those raw products and a quality control intervention and assure ourselves that they are all going to meet the final criteria or the kite mark or whatever that final aim is. And if we, in primary school, if we're, educating children for jobs that don't exist yet, why are we thinking about Nat 5s? Why are we thinking about looking towards Highers or looking towards further education? We don't know what that's going to look like. So to simply assess literacy, numeracy, it's not good enough. But that is where the pressure is. And because there is a pressure and a time issue around all of that, what that takes, the other things that we can get through feedback and through observations are not moving forward with the child. Take a breath, because I went on to a wee bit of a rant there. We have always tested, and it's never been good. We've done, I started one of the first jobs that I had as a deputy head teacher was to administer the Daniels and Dyack reading test for all the children in my department. I cannot describe how demoralising that was. The only interesting thing I can say about that was it's the first time I ever saw a head lice. One of them dropped onto the paper that I was using with a child. And that is where the interest stopped. I could recite that. And so could most of the children who'd got up to question 15 before they got the 3 wrong and their age, the reading age, was assigned to them. We did the Edinburgh reading tests. We did the PIPs and the POPs and the CMEs and the ACERs, and now we're on to SNASAs. We're now being told, use the data. My problem is, as management teams and as teachers, you get used to one set of data, and then something political happens, and suddenly you're trying to compare one set of data with another set of data, because somebody has decided it's wrong to test primary ones, or it's wrong to test primary sevens, or this system is better than that system. So tracking progress through these standardised tests actually is like nailing jelly to a tree, depending on which year you happened to come in. Go to nursery, and it's very different. The children come in, assessment is fluid. It is about the child. It's about learning conversations. It's about learning observations. About and with the child and with their parents. And we're taking all that information in. There is an issue there moving into primary school with pupil-teacher ratio, which I accept. But I think the value of how they do things and how we do things in early years cannot be overlooked in this conversation. Sometimes I feel that the misconception around education is that they treat every child as if every child was the same raw product. They treat us as if the SIMD, the Scottish Index of Multi-Deprivation doesn't change in an area. It changes dramatically, and that comes with consequences for the family too. My own school has gone from 23% to 32% free school meals since the start of the last lockdown. We assume that families don't suffer adverse experiences. And we assume that teaching standards are universally high, or that teachers don't go off sick, or that management don't go in and do a lesson badly, because I can tell you that often happens, or that the assessment goalposts won't change. What I really, really think is that we need to look at the early years, how we look at the whole child, and how we can apply that to children as they move through our education system. And only that way are we really going to get learning and teaching for a 21st century with the appropriate feedback round about that. All right, that's my rant over.
Thanks for that, Jen. And I think, again, really helpful, because one of the issues that's coming through from your contribution also came through from Mark's, and it's this whole idea that we're prepared to trust exams but not prepared to trust teachers.
Yes.
And one of the things that we know we do is we gerrymander the pass mark in national certification. So 1 year in maths, for example, it was 34% in the alternative higher maths or whatever it was. Who would have thought that in maths 34 would be half 100? But there you go. That's what happened. And I always remember my first markers meeting, where our instruction from the chief examiner was, well, as long as you make sure that all the clever bairns pass and all the stupid ones fail, you'll have done your job. And yet that's what we trust above teachers. So we need to think about how we get that change over culture and thinking. And I think you've made a really good start. People loving the rant. They're enjoying that. What I want to do now is, sorry?
Picking up on the continuous assessment, the feedback, moving learning forwards.
Absolutely. And we'll come back and pick up on that. What I want to do now is to move on to Darren. And Darren McKinnon's he's a quality improvement manager, formerly a maths teacher, and just absolutely delighted to have Darren come on, because we need the perspective from the secondary practitioners as well. And Darren threatened earlier on that he was going to represent the grumpy secondary teachers. That's a voice we need to hear in that discussion, because if we don't move forward with them, we won't move forward without them. So really looking forward, Darren, to hearing from you. Over to you.
Thanks very much, David. Thanks for the invite. I should say, and I don't know if you normally get this disclaimer, that I will say straight away that the views that I'm about to express do not represent the views of Edinburgh Council, for whom I work, and they're solely my own views. And any offence that I give is certainly not meant. In terms of the talks that we've had, because I was asked to kind of respond to them. I loved Louise's point about the DNA of learning. To hear about curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment intertwining, I think that is absolutely right. And there was a little slide in there, which I quite like, because I'm not necessarily again testing. I know that others may have different views, and we hear people talking about teaching to the test. I have to be honest. In my background, you can't really teach to higher maths. It is not possible to coach someone through higher maths. It's an assault course. Same with National 5, to be honest. And by the way, can I just give Mark a row for having a slightly derogatory cartoon about maths there, and thereby perpetuating the myth that it always seems to be the maths teachers that are bad. You all know about your R numbers now, so sometimes statistics is worth knowing about, and it's joyous to know that people know what an R number is now, even though they've apparently no idea what 2 meters actually is. Ask your maths teacher for a meter stick sometime. But Louise talked about tests worth teaching to, and that would be interesting to explore. I think that's a really interesting point. We were faced with the challenge last year of how do we assess the bairns without the test, without the SQA exam. And the fascinating thing is, the world didn't end. There was a lot of political interest and actions, but the world didn't end. Teachers were able to do it. And it maybe throws up questions, thinking, I'm not sure that that you mentioned it, Mark, but the issue of appeals and so on. It was interesting because it does beg the question of how well are we equipping our young people to know what their progress is like in a course? Why should it be a surprise for them to discover what sort of grade they have at the end? I like what Mark said about the mix of continuous assessment, a kind of mixed bag of assessment. I would say I'm not convinced that high stakes continuous assessment does anyone favours, and it will be interesting to hear from our learners at the end of this year, because I think for some of them it's been a very pressurised situation where all these little tests that maybe little quizzes that you do through the year, you're suddenly worrying whether or not they're going to define your future. And that's not to defend relying on one big exam at the end either. I think I agree with Mark when he talks about the issue of competency-based testing, and it was interesting to hear him talk about different approaches. I would say, as something of an old git, that when higher still came in around 2000, we saw a combining of approaches, which included some approaches in assessment from further education, and we saw something of a unitization of knowledge, I would say. And we saw far more teaching to the test, if I'm honest, through the whole business of NABs. So apologies if you're not from secondary background or you're young in secondary, don't know what NABs were. And then the kind of unit tests that we have now. And there's a lot of teaching to the test going on, which is not in any way good. I think my issue, though, is that we have an opportunity now to look at what we do and to ask why we're doing it. Teachers came up with the goods in terms of assessing young people, even though they weren't in the exam hall. And now this year they're being asked to assess young people even though they're not in school, which is quite an ask. And I know our teachers will rise to that challenge. But without getting into too many details, you have to wonder, you talked about a 2-term dash, Mark. We have a succession of 2-term dashes now. We have a 2-term dash in 4th year, a 2-term dash in 5th year, and if you're around, a 2-term dash in 6th year for these high stakes exams. And if someone can tell me why we have high stakes exams in 4th year, when I'll take a punt, 90+% of our learners stay on, why we are putting them through that in 4th year, if someone can tell me why, I'd be pleased to hear it, because I think the answer is it's IBeen. And we saw this way back, and I'm talking decades, 50 years ago or whatever, when we had the hires and then we brought in the lowers. I say we, I wasn't personally there, but we had the lowers, and then suddenly people wanted to go through the lowers to have that kind of safety net in case they didn't pass the hires. So suddenly we had exams in 4th year and then exams in 5th year. Most of our learners stay on to 6th year. So I think the idea in CFE was to assess when it's appropriate, and to have your eye on what young people were leaving with at the end of their assessment journey, their learner journey. But we've not got that right, and maybe we're a bit feared, if I'm honest. Maybe we're a bit feared as staff, and certainly a bit feared as parents and carers, because if you've negotiated your way through Scottish education relatively successfully, your view tends to be that it worked fine for you, therefore what's the issue? There are good things coming out just now with National Progression Awards and, I won't say alternative certification, that's a real insult, but things beyond national qualifications. Stop obsessing about Nat 5s and hires. And I think we have a huge opportunity now. Normally, I think teachers are quite conservative. We've been through it all with a small C, I should emphasise, and resistant to change in the secondary staff room anyway. But I'll say this, I think teachers are fed up with assessment now. I'm not necessarily blaming SQA, but honestly, I think for the past 10 years, there's been a change every year to 1 or 2 or 3 levels of assessment, and that has stopped secondary staff getting to real grips with the BGE, which is where we know we need to make a difference if we're to set young people up for success later on. So, if this is about being creative, and I'm not saying I want to get rid of them, but why was it that when we reviewed CFE, we said, hire is the gold standard, thou shalt not touch the hire, just out of interest? Because we were told standard grade was no longer fit for purpose. That was a given, apparently. But apparently you don't touch the hire. You don't touch that high stakes exam at the end of 5th year, even though most people stay on till 6th year. So if Mark is talking about a mix of assessment methodology and courses that genuinely make coherent sense through what we call currently the senior phase, I would love to explore that. I think that sounds really, really interesting. I could say more. I think I've covered most. There's politics through all this. There's politics in the accountability agenda. I think we have it far more right than they have down south. We don't have league tables here until, of course, the newspapers put them together, relying on FOIs or whatever. I think data can be used intelligently and sensitively, but it has to be our data. It has to be something we have a sense of ownership of. And I completely appreciate what Jennifer said, where you're suddenly told, well, never mind this piece of data. What about this piece of data here when things change midstream? And the example you gave, Jennifer, of the outcomes being rewritten or repurposed for assessment, or we go down particular routes of significant aspects for learning. Anyone remember those? We had SALs for a while, and then they were taken round the back and quietly taken out with a silencer. No one ever speaks to them again. And that's just more change that we maybe didn't need. What am I saying there? Well, I'm saying, Mark, that even when you talk about collegiality, which I think is key, but you talk about the role, say, of RICs and local authorities, there'll be people jumping up and down with excitement and or horror at a slide that has those things in it because of their small p, large p political interests. I didn't prepare a talk for this. I really wanted to just respond to what was said. And I guess what I'm saying is, Mark, I like the idea of what you're saying about a more coherent package of learning. And I love the DNA strand metaphor. I think that's absolutely correct. And my plea is, can we please talk about 4th year and what we're doing to the wains? And that's me.
And thanks for that, Dan. I mean, I think one of the things that's coming through in the chat, which is interesting, is that people are very comfortable with the general direction that the conversations are taking. But real questions coming up about how do we make a different system work? Because when we've tried to change assessment before, it's often resulted in an increase in workload rather than anything else. And so I think people would appreciate any practical suggestions. And Dan, you've done that. You know, you've done that by saying, let's take out one of the major stages in terms of national assessments for certification. Let's think about what we can take out of the system. So any comments that can be made around that, I think, would be really interesting. The other thing that I would just want to pick up from the chat is that Susie Lundy has been making some really good and strong contributions as we go through. So an open invitation, Susie, if you want to put your hand up and come into the conversation and give a flavour of what you're saying in the chat to everyone, that would be really welcome as well. And the same invitation goes to others. If you want to just click on your raised hand and make a contribution, more than welcome that. But any of the panel want to come in on this idea of what is it we need to do to make a different system work?
Has anybody thought of speaking to learners who have just finished further education? If we're giving children a voice, then, you know, if 4-year-olds can tell you how they want to learn and how they want to do the next steps, then surely somebody who's just completed a university education would be able to feed into that conversation. Helpful.
Louise, did you want to come in?
I was just going to say that I think we need to be really clear about what it is that we're trying to do. And that my worry is that if we begin by let me use a good old-fashioned Scottish word, if we begin by footering about without really having a clear idea of what it is that we're trying to move towards, then we end up in the position that we continuously end up in, which is, you know, it's like the myth of Sisyphus, you know, we keep rolling the boulder uphill only to have it roll back down again. So, because one of the really interesting points that Darren made is that, you know, many of us who've been in the system for a long time remember the fact that curriculum for excellence, as Darren said, was intended to radically reduce the volume of high stakes assessment, and that young people would only be engaged in a high stake assessment at the point where they stopped in that area. Not that they would undertake something in 4th year, 5th year, then 6th year. But because we didn't actually engage in the discussion with wider society, and remember that the parents of our young people have come through a system that they remember, and they look for similar patterns in the system now. So if we're serious about making a difference, then there has to be a comprehensive engagement of parents, of employers, of universities, of teachers, of young people, centrally young people, so that we actually develop a shared notion of what it is we're trying to do. Otherwise, the conversation degenerates into, is it exams or is it not exams?
I'm going to bring Mark in, and then we'll move to Susie and Sharon Kroom, who've both got their hands up, if that's okay. Mark.
Yes, I'm very conscious here that there are people who've had their hands up for longer than me, but I'll be brief here. I mean, for me, the core question here relates to educational purpose. The core question is what sort of values, knowledge, skills, attributes do we want to emerge from a process of education? In other words, what sort of young person do we want the education system to produce? And then that raises very interesting questions across a whole range of practices, including assessment. It raises questions about what we want them to know, for example, and arguably CFE has been, well, it's been accused of downgrading knowledge. And, you know, we've moved from a situation where we perhaps learned facts, an academic trivial pursuit, to one where we're over focusing on skills. And actually what we've lost in the process is the detailed and systematic conceptual understanding of the world. So that's one area. Pedagogy is another area, because if we know what sort of young person we want to produce, then we can start to ask questions about how we best achieve that through pedagogy. And assessment, of course, is part of that. You know, if we're clear about what we want to achieve, then we can hopefully avoid the sort of assessment systems that actively militate against that vision. And that's what we have at the moment, I think. So there's a few points there. I'll let others come in now.
Thanks. Susie Lundy, would you like to come in?
Hi, David. Thanks for your invitation. I always love listening to all this chat and always just kind of sit back and listen. But it's so interesting, all of this. I suppose I'm a drama teacher and come from a discipline that is in itself multidisciplinary, and that gives us a privilege and a special perspective that's unique, and it's also, you know, a way down the pecking order in the subject hierarchy that we have in secondary schools. And I always feel sad about that, because I think it's a very important part of learning, and it's an important learning experience. I looked into some international models of interdisciplinary working lately, and amongst a round robin of different sites and sources, found the Creative Bravery Festival, which is extraordinary and has lots of incredible resources within it, and it's linked to lots of other things. And one of the things I fell upon was High Tech High in the States, where they have a model of working which is quite left field. They have multidisciplinary teams who work together collaboratively in the BGE phase, and they team teach and they work on projects only, and they've removed all summative assessment entirely, other than what they describe as exhibitions. And the exhibitions are opportunities for learners to show their work and achievements to an audience. And there were some utterly stunning projects in there, very radical, and quite hard to get your head round. But there's a documentary on Vimeo about it, and it was so fascinating just to see. But they used Socratic seminar with 11 to 14-year-olds on a daily basis to evaluate and reflect each day on their progress and how they're learning and what their targets are. And so it's completely learner-led, and it's just such an interesting thing to find that something like that exists within a school academy system like that, and is there for us to see examples of. So I feel quite passionately that I think that multidisciplinary approach is missing, but there just isn't enough capacity for teachers to collaborate. We don't have the time. We're working in these silos in isolation, and real collaboration is not understood well enough. So that's my piece. But I think what I would love to see is just much deeper understanding of collaborative practice for teachers.
And thank you for that, Susie. And also thank you, I think, for highlighting a number of the ways that we have into this discussion and ways that we have into change. And also for the mention of the Creative Bravery discussion, sired, of course, by the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, beloved by many of us and much mourned. Can I now ask Sharon Croom to come in?
Yes, hello, thank you. It was something that I was thinking of replying to Mark about, is this idea of having resources that were maybe more, I think you were talking about maybe at a more national level, but then they could actually then be applied on a more local level. And one of the things I was looking at, I think, is that I've left teaching and I've actually come back into it. But I came back in after the Curriculum for Excellence had been imagined. I'd been a mum bringing up my children, listening to this conversation that was happening, and I was really wanting to be part of it. But something I found has really helped me is watching how my children grew up. I've had 4 children in the time that I have left teaching, and I watched how they learned. I looked and felt that they just had this drive that was all about learning through their, more than 22 senses we know that we have. And yet what I found was once they entered the school system, a lot of the ways that they had become as people, those things that drive their learning, they weren't valued, they weren't used as the driver of that child's learning. We know that children, I'm a science teacher, and I find this idea of curiosity being used throughout every single subject. Observation, curiosity, learning through your experiences. And then all of a sudden they come into this classroom and that isn't about that anymore. And those things are the kind of essentials for which that child has made sense of their world, made sense of who they actually are. So if you don't have a system that values those things, you actually undermine the sense making that that child has spent all that time doing, the values that that family have brought to that wee person, and also as well you deny them something of themselves. And I think some of the trauma that teachers feel every day is the fact that we know we are in a system that actually does that to young people, and every time we are maybe putting them through a high stakes test or doing something that we personally know and feel is actually not best for that young person, it hurts us. And it's this cycle of dehumanizing, because if you're hurting another individual, you're actually, in a way, you're hurting yourself. And there's an important aspect of curriculum for excellence that I absolutely love, and it's this idea of E's and O's. And how I envisage my curriculum is that I'm being asked, what educational experiences am I putting on that will give this particular outcome? And I always use that as the kind of driver. I'm being asked to put on an experience, and then the outcome is what they will have learned. And I think that flip is something that has really helped me in looking at creativity and using it as the driver of the children's learning. And then the assessment just fits so much more into that, because you understand why you're assessing. So it's that flipping and being able to reimagine and re-envisage the curriculum. And the throwball course that I did within Edinburgh, and also putting my children into the Cowgate Under Fives nursery, which is, you know, internationally recognised for the view of the child and the call to have a pedagogy that is honouring the child, honouring the family, and what that young person can bring to their curriculum. I think that's a really important aspect of what we have available.
Fantastic, and thank you for that, and thank you for the language that you've brought to that. I love that whole language of honouring the pupil and honouring the experience, and I love the whole idea of teachers needing to have integrity, and when their integrity is robbed from them, that hurts. And I think that's just such an important contribution. Before I allow anyone, so he said fascistically, before I allow anybody to come in on that one, I'm just going to go to Stephen Kelly and Michael Irvin, who both had their hands up. Stephen, would you like to come in first?
Yeah, thanks, David. I think there's lots to be learned from the disaster of what happened with CFE the last time we tried to introduce some holistic assessment. There was no coherence in the system. People didn't understand what we were trying to do. That certainly speaks what Louise was talking about doing your spade work and laying the ground properly, deciding in terms of what sort of people we want to have, and that's what Mark was talking about. Because what I remember is people not understanding what holistic assessment was about, people trying to make the 5 to 14 materials fit the new system without any really thoughts about the core principles. People at the meso level not understanding what they were trying to do in getting HMI coming into schools and changing their tune every time they saw something different. And the whole system was left confused because that spade work at the start wasn't done, because people were still in their head about what they thought assessment was and what they were trying to do, and their heads were not in a place to really embrace the new world of curriculum for excellence. Now we are 20 years later, kind of the dust has kind of settled, and we're now saying maybe we're in a better place now to do it differently and do it more effectively. So that's me.
Well, high value contribution. I love that. It's me at the end. That was great. Let's bring in Michael.
Thanks, Dave and Linda, for the organising. Brilliant session into the panel. It's been a great session so far. Mike Irving, head teacher at Leith Academy in Edinburgh. Just following on from Steve, I think as a head teacher, we absolutely want to be creative. We absolutely want to stop obsessing about a dated and old-fashioned way of assessment in a more agency-based way if possible. But perhaps, and this is my kind of point to Louise, Mark, and to the wider panel, but perhaps it would help if we don't publicise in the press a list of top performing schools based on 5 hires through FOIs. We don't produce data in a blunt way on factors such as 5 at 3, 5 at 4, 5 at 5, and greater value, wider assessment-based courses, and not in a condescending way, like a wee pat on the head, oh, well done, you got yourself a foundation apprenticeship, but actually truly valuing that. Those same 5+ measures featuring in the summary of inspection findings that come through judgmental weeks with a statement of either excellent or unsatisfactory attached to them. And the political and public nature of that sharing, all of those things, and how that is shared. And I think as a head teacher, a colleague, somebody who's interested in children, we would welcome a more modern approach. And I suppose my question is, do the panel believe that this shared value that Mark and Louise clearly talk about, our shared value and purpose of education and assessment, can be shared and upheld by political, judgmental and media-based organisations? It's an easy one.
Thanks. I mean, I love that easy question. Great. What I'm now going to do is panel have had a chance to listen to a whole range of things. There's some absolutely brilliant stuff coming up in the chat as well. And let's just go around and give each of you a chance to respond to that. Darren, let's start with you. Your contribution seemed to strike a range of notes. And don't feel under pressure. I mean, it's a case of if there are things you want to add at this point, go ahead and add them. And if not, just pass the ball.
Well, there was one thing that I kind of meant to mention, and this will sound like a little bit, maybe too much focused on an exam, but it was something that I saw someone talk about, and I think this was maybe down south where they were trying to assess young person, whilst they weren't in school. And what they said was, and this was to do with, the overestimation, the SQA model. We had the same thing down south where, grades were put down and kids from poorer backgrounds generally were more greatly disadvantaged. And what the teacher said was that, he kind of knew his learners pretty well. And without, it was his job to categorize them. Hell, it was his job to put them in rank order. Let's remind ourselves. But his point was, I can look at those kids there, and I know that those 3 kids would get an A. See the next 2 or 3, maybe. You know what? 2 out of 3 definitely. I can't tell you which ones though. And let's remember again, they were forced to try and do that last year. And I think what happened last year was that teachers thought, well, I'm not going to do that to those kids. I'm not going to replicate that judgment in the exam hall to the degree of, arguing over 1 point or whatever. And so it's like the teacher thought, knowing the learners, I'm going to imagine what you would get on the best day of your life in an exam. And I don't know if you can, I don't know if you can do that through an exam, but I'm just struck that we need a system that allows our kids to show the best that they can be on a day, on a year, whatever, so that they're not judged, and they're not judged and sentenced down to 1 mark or 2 mark. And we could talk for ages, David, about your point about, raising or lowering pass marks. And, I know that if there's aspects in maths that kids get better at, because let's be honest, hopefully we teach them better, they might be considered A-grade material, but then SQA will put it down because the kids have got too good at those questions. So we need to change it. So we're kind of penalising the staff and teachers. But wouldn't it be good to have a system that imagined the best that kids could be, rather than making it, you know, the worst day of their life? That's all I'll say.
No, thank you. Jen?
Yeah, I just like to, you know, it's a hard one. I'll go back to Mike Irving's question about the, you know, is our government going to be brave enough to not publish? The governments need to step back from education. Politics and education, politics and religion have no place in education apart from teaching about what kind of goes on in them. There's too much of an influence, and there's too many politicians that are prepared to stand up and say, you know, education, education, education. If you're going to judge me on one thing, judge me on education. But it's us that are being judged, and that puts us right back into that fear of getting things wrong box, not the creativity. Education Scotland has to be involved in this, that's imperative. And it was Jackie Reid in the comments made a perfect comment there, because I'm in my 3-up assessment head at the moment. I know as soon as I get word of an HMI visit, I'll be getting how good is our 4 out and looking at the QIs. And that's not creative. It's become too pinned down, it's been nailed down. We need to look at creativity, we need to bring back professional autonomy and teacher trust and moderation to pull that all together.
Thank you. Thank you. Mark.
Okay, I want to address directly the issue of how we change the way people think about education. I don't think it's I mean, it's not just the general population, it's everyone, it's teachers as well, I think. Elliot Eisner quipped several years ago that teaching was the only profession where professional socialization begins at the age of 5. It is very difficult to imagine a different education system. Now, if teachers struggle with that, and we have teacher education, which, I mean, for me, one of the big success stories of Scottish education has been the teacher education, particularly the master's level programs over the last 10 to 15 years. We are transforming the culture within schools. I see a lot of very good teachers, a lot of capacity actually emerging from within the system. The challenge is how we use that in a systemic way. However, there is the wider issue of what politicians and the wider community think about education, and the media is a particular problem. It's a particular problem when education is used quite uncritically and actually quite cynically at times to attack the existing government. We saw that very clearly with the SQA review. I believe I would be termed as collateral damage there. My supposed political views were held out as being somehow in cahoots with the government when I'd been asked to do an independent review. When the review was critical, I was then criticised for being overcritical, and then a few weeks later I was criticised again because we'd made some changes to the draft report on the basis of feedback. So that's the way the press operates, and they're always going to do the league tables. I don't think there's any way around that. I think there's a better solution, which is actually to use the media to get the messages out. And we had a go at this about 3 or 4 years ago with a series of articles led by Graham Donaldson, in fact, from teachers and other educators about what constitutes a good education. I think we need a much louder voice from the profession, from educators out in the media about what education is really about, what it's for, how it's best done, all of that sort of stuff. And until we do that, I think we're going to have the same problem.
Okay, Louise?
I'll just pick up from Mark. I think that what Mark's saying has a great deal of integrity and sense. And I think that I suppose there are 2 issues for me. The first is that I think we need conversations. So it isn't about the profession. I don't mean that you meant this, Mark, but it's just emphasising a point that it isn't about the profession telling everyone what education is about. It's about listening. It's, you know, it's Jen said, it's the engagement with young people, it's the engagement with parents, it's the engagement with, you know, education belongs to society. It doesn't belong to any one or any one group. And the other thing that I think, David, just to end on from my perspective, is that what I've been really conscious about is the number of contributions in the session that have emphasised the fact that assessment is not an event but a system. and ideas of assessment to support learning is not just about the classroom. In the same way that if a young person is judged, then that will turn them off education. In the same way, if a teacher is judged or a school is judged, then any opportunity to learn is moved to one side, and the focus is all on the judgment of assessment rather than the opportunity to use evidence to help the system, the school or the local authority or the nation to progress. And it seems a simple idea, but it's fundamental to the process of change. And unless we can shift from seeing assessment as about judgment and categorization to seeing assessment as the means of gathering evidence to help us to learn and progress, we will always be in these circular arguments.
And I think, unfortunately, we could run on with this. I mean, clearly this is a conversation that's got fantastic mileage, and we may well return to it at a later stage. But numbers are dropping, and I think people just have had enough by this stage in the day. I think some really key messages just to finish off on. One of the first things is that we need to understand what change takes. And one of the messages that's come through from the chat and come through from the conversations have been that we need to free up time. Jen used the expression earlier in the conversation, headspace. You know, we keep saying to people in the middle of the most difficult situations that many of them have managed, that it's time to reinvent the system. Well, yes, it is. But if you're in a school that's trying to deal with all of the issues that schools are dealing with through COVID, your response is going to be, give me peace. You know, I think we need to give people the sense of time and space. I think the other point, Mark made this really well earlier on in the discussion, and Darren picked up on it with real vigour, that if we're going to make a change, we need to resource the change, we need to be serious about it, and we need to stick to it. And that's what we haven't done. That what we've done is we've flitted from fix to fix. And what we've had is repairs and not reform. And in a sense, I think critically, that's what Scottish education is good at. We're good at the repair from time to time. We're not very good at the reform. And often we stick to the repair long after it's outlived its usefulness. I think the other big message that's come through, and I love the stuff about the meso levels from Mark, it's the idea that we need to support the change at all levels, not simply when we're making it, but when we're sustaining and embedding it. And I think that's been a really powerful message. We also, I think, need to show people the endpoints. I think it's always been difficult when we've talked about change. Happened classically with CFE. Lots of people didn't really believe in what it was until they saw the exams. And then suddenly it was a case of, oh, is this it? And that whole idea, we tried it with standard grade. We tried at least to put out sample exams which let people see what assessment might look like. And the issue that's coming through all the time is the one of trust. Unless we move forward in a climate of trust, we will never successfully get change. And one of the things that's bewildered to me is how teachers can be trusted to use assessment to plan learning, but they can't be trusted to use it for any other purpose. Because if teachers can't assess, they can't plan learning appropriately for children, and the system is continually under threat and perpetually failing. So there must be a level of validity and reliability in teacher assessment. Otherwise, we're not getting effective planning. And again, we need to pick up and build on that and develop that. And one of the other questions that I think you've left us with is, why do we keep doing other people's assessment for them? If the issue is that we are assessing so that other people can make choices among the youngsters that we're educating and developing, then we're always going to finish up with the system warped at the end. And that's come through a lot. So there's a much, much bigger debate to be had around this. But what I think we've had tonight is a fantastic start to that. and more than a start. We've had really good contributions that have been realistic, that have been well informed, that have been theoretical, and there's been a huge amount of value that's come through from the contributors as well as from the panel. So thanks to everyone from that. We're going to sign off for now. Thanks to everyone for their attendance. Thanks to the panel. For me, that's been a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much indeed.